Welcome back everyone. I really enjoyed reading Confessions of a Mask by Yukio Mishima, and so I thought I'd read another one of his books. So today we're going to be talking about The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea, published in 1963. This discussion will definitely be more analysis than review, so there will be spoilers, so if that bugs you, then please stop watching. But for those of you that are still here, let's get on with it. Part 1. Summary. Norabu Kuroda is an adolescent boy living in Japan. He and his mother live alone together, his father having died some years before. Norabu's mother, Fusako, is an upper-class woman who owns a European-style haute fashion clothing store called Rex. Norabu has three interests in his life. Fusako, whom he likes to watch through a peephole in his room while she changes, his friends, a gang of pious young men who believe in traditional Japanese moral values, and ships. One day, Fusako takes Norabu to the harbour to see some ships, and they meet a sailor called Riji. Norabu respects Riji and sees him as a man who has turned away from his personal feelings and attachments and is drawn instead to the great ocean. Unfortunately, Norabu's admiration starts to wane as Riju and Fusako develop a relationship. Norabu, spurred on by his gang, start a terrible and gruesome plot against Riju for his betrayal of the sea. Part 2. Japanese Culture and Westernization. The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea, which I'll just call The Sailor from now on because that's much easier, is traditionally analysed as a story about the Westernization of Japan after the Second World War. And the different characters in the book are meant to represent different aspects of this theme. Norabu and his gang represent Mishima's own values, these values being very nationalistic, against Westernization, and also very masculine. Fusako represents the Westernization of Japan, with her shop where they only really sell Western products, and also the fact that she doesn't really take in any traditional Japanese events except for on special occasions. And lastly, we have Riji, whose name I'm definitely not pronouncing properly, but I do my best, who represents traditional Japanese culture with his obsession with nature and the ocean. On this interpretation of the novel, the romance between Fusako and Riji is essentially Riji finding himself in a dilemma where he has to choose between traditional Japanese culture and the new Western Japan, and in choosing Fusako as a partner, he is betraying that Japanese heritage and becoming part of the Westernization. What that means then is that when Norabu and the gang take revenge, they're basically punishing Riji for betraying Japanese culture. What I find very interesting about this interpretation of the book is how much it mirrors Mishima himself and also his own death. Mishima himself would take action to defend Japanese culture in a very similar way to the way that Norabu does, at least if we see Norabu's doing this as more of a metaphor. Mishima would attempt a coup d'etat at the Japanese government, attempting to recapture some of that traditional heritage that he believed had been lost due to the Westernization of Japan after the Second World War. At the end of this coup d'etat, Mishima killed himself by seppuku, which is a traditional Japanese method of suicide used by samurai. This traditional Japanese sacrificial death in many ways mirrors what happens to Riji at the end of The Sailor Who Fell from Grace. Both Mishima and Riju die on behalf of that Japan that is now lost. Both deaths also have this element of heroism about them, as if they're dying for some great cause. I will just add very briefly that I am assuming that Riji dies in the story. It is something that's left ambiguous, and you could definitely imagine that maybe he doesn't die, but I think given the way the story goes, it's pretty likely that he does die at the end, and so that's why I'm saying that he does, because I think it's pretty obvious, at least from my interpretation, that he does die at the end. So these parallels between Mishima's life and his death and the story just make the story all that more interesting to me. I didn't know fully about this parallel until I was doing research about the book for this video, but I'm definitely looking forward to going back and reading the book and picking up on some more of those connections. And if you haven't read the book before, I definitely recommend maybe doing some of your own research on Mishima's life and seeing how his life is mirrored in the plot of this story. I think it'll definitely make for a much more interesting and definitely much darker reading experience. Part 3. Masculinity and Glory. So in my discussion of Confessions of a Mask, I noted how a big theme in Mishima's writing seems to be this glorification of masculinity and power, and this hatred of weakness, submission and compassion. As a child, Mishima was very weak and sickly, and as he grew up he realised that he was gay. All of these things seem to contribute to him developing, later in his life, an obsession with masculinity, an obsession with appearing strong and powerful to others. This would culminate in an obsession not just with the military, but also with bodybuilding. In Confessions of a Mask, the character uses this obsession with masculinity to hide his sexuality. We don't have that sexuality stuff going on in The Sailor Who Fell from Grace, but we do certainly have this obsession with masculinity and power, and seeing this as something that's going to liberate man from his weaknesses as a human being. The themes about masculinity and power are reflected mostly in Norubu and his gang of wild boys. They're obsessed with very traditional ideas about morality. They think that human beings should be beyond the pleasures of the flesh. Men should not, have sex with women. They should be pure. They should rise above all of their bodily urges. They also mustn't show compassion to people because compassion is a sign of weakness. And for the people who do go against these precepts, the gang has a very hard punishment in store. In fact, the chief of the group, who is simply just called the chief, is so aggressive and insistent on his detachment from any kind of compassion that he actually, before we even get to the murder of Riji, kills his pet cat. He tears it open and dissects it to prove that he is above compassion, that he is strong and powerful. So it's a very, very dark and dangerous kind of philosophy that this gang of boys has going. And even though Mishima seems to champion this kind of powerful persona, as a reader it doesn't come across like it's being championed. It's incredibly scary and it's very dehumanizing to the characters that get involved into it. Another thing that I found really interesting about this gang is how faceless and dehumanized they are as characters. I've already said that the chief is just called the chief, but the other boys don't even get that accolade. They're simply called by numbers. Norubu is the only one that gets a name, and I think that's just because we follow him. If this story followed one of the other characters, then Norubu would just be known by a number as well. Now obviously giving them just numbers does draw a lot of parallels to the military and basically making them disposable soldiers, but it also dehumanizes them. These aren't really people anymore, they're just blind sheep following this evil chief. And even the chief himself doesn't have an identity outside of being the chief. He's just the leader who is leading them down this path. There's nothing more to his character. They've all just become part of this tribe, and that's all there is to their personality anymore. We do learn a little bit about the backgrounds and families of these boys. They all seem to be from relatively privileged backgrounds. It seems like their family life is one in which the parents aren't really around. They just live alone in these big empty houses. And so they've never really experienced true love and affection, which is why these boys are so susceptible to the chief and his precepts. He's telling them that there is no meaning to any of that stuff. He's telling them that the family is a pointless thing and that they shouldn't look for love with women. It's all pointless. And they believe that because that's what their life is. That's how hollow it is. And to think about this in terms of the stuff from the previous part about Westernization, this could also be seen as a commentary on that. These upper class families have kind of betrayed traditional Japanese culture, and now the younger generation is just completely lost and alone and has no real identity. For Norubu and his gang, the ideal man is barely even human. He's nothing more than a glory seeker, a man who's obsessed with adventure and denying himself any of the things that a human being would enjoy, like personal attachments, friendship and love. And also, more likely than not, he's going to be morbidly fascinated with death and glory and dying a glorious death. And all of this is why Norubu and the boys are initially attracted to Riji. This is a man who has turned away from society. He's gone to the sea and he likes it out there. He likes the solitary life. He likes to be alone. He doesn't like to be on the land. He's turned his back on civilization. He's turned his back on the westernization of Japan just to be in nature, to be at the sea. And obviously the boys find this really attractive because here's this older guy who is doing the things that they preach. They all idolize this sailor as the glory seeker that they want to be, and they romanticize this man who's going out to sea and will probably die at sea, but they see that as a good thing. They see it as part of the hero's journey and the hero's arc, if you like. Because the boys are so obsessed with this, what this means is that when Riji starts to come into Norubu's life, and by all accounts is a pretty good stepfather, he lets Norubu get away with quite a lot of mischief, they don't like this. Norubu hates this. One of the first things that Riji does to irritate Norubu is when Norubu is out with his friends when he shouldn't be, he should be somewhere else, and Riji catches him, and Norubu's expecting to be punished, he's expecting this to go terribly, but Riji just says, don't worry about it, it's fine, do what you like, I'm not going to tell your mum. And, most of us as kids, if that was our stepdad, would be like, great, this is exactly what we want. But for Norubu, this act of compassion, this act of kindness is the first kind of strike on the board to turn him against Riji. Norubu doesn't want a nice, kind father. He wants this patriarchal figure who's going to bully him and torment him and be cruel to him and punish him when he's done the wrong thing. Again, this all plays into this extreme masculinity that Mishima and his characters seem to buy into. This extreme form of masculinity just doesn't leave any room for compassion or kindness, and that's what Mishima and his characters seem to want. Part 4, Final Thoughts. I really enjoyed this book, and I felt like in comparison to Confessions of a Mask, it was a lot more tightly structured and focused than that story. Confessions of a Mask was a bit more stream of consciousness, more internal, whereas this story was much more focused on the plot, and many of the characters didn't have, the most complex or interesting or nuanced psychologies. So I think whether or not you prefer this to Confessions of a Mask, it might depend on what you prefer in a novel. If you prefer a plot-based novel, then maybe this story. But if you prefer a in-depth psychological novel, then Confessions of a Mask is definitely going to be where your preferences lie. There also really is no fat in the story. It's very short, it's very concise, and in reviews, a common complaint that I saw was that people weren't really a fan of that. They thought there just wasn't enough meat to really, appreciate the characters. But actually I felt like it worked quite well for this story. It's a pretty brutal story, and it's got a lot of tension, and I feel like if you bloated that out with any kind of padding, it might actually ruin the tension and ruin the dramatic kind of feel of the plot. It's very stark, it's very economical, but it really works in its favour. Okay, that's it for my thoughts on The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. If you've read this story, let me know what you think about it in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to my channel for updates for new videos. I post new videos on Mondays at 4 PM UK time. But that's it for this video, so take care everyone, I'll see you all next time.